Before we jump into today's topic, a quick disclaimer. The stories and data we share come from the states that we practice in and the experiences that we personally had, which can differ greatly across our country and certainly the globe. This is not a professional advice show. So let's get comfy and talk about death.
Hello, and welcome to MortMic. I'm Jem.
And I'm Red, and we're your deputies of deathcare. So today's topic, we're going to talk about our credentials for why we're able to be here and talking to you in the first place. And then just a little bit about what got us into this mess we call deathcare in the first place.
Yeah, so because it's our first episode, we wanted to kind of give you guys an introduction to what this podcast is going to be about. A lot of people have questions about death and dying and anything that goes hand in hand with that. So if you've ever had a relative that's passed away, or wondered about death in any capacity, this is the podcast for you.
Yeah, absolutely. We want to be able to go into episodes where we answer questions from you guys and just kind of touch on a little bit of everything, because there is a lot that goes on in the death care industry that is kind of mysterious for those outside of it. So we're here to answer those questions, and we also kind of just want it to be a way that we can just have a relaxed talk about it. It's nothing too serious.
Yeah, death is nothing to be afraid of, and we want you guys to be able to feel comfortable, relaxed while we discuss some deathly details. You might hear some things that sound unfamiliar or something that just sounds pretty crazy, but that's what our podcast is going to be about, discussing everything that we talk about in this episode and more. So if you do have a burning question, you can definitely shoot us an email or hit us up on Facebook. We just want to be able to answer all your death questions.
Absolutely. So I guess I'll go ahead and get started here with my whole spiel, my story, my backstory. Mine's pretty simple. I kind of did a very straightforward and to the point path to death care. So starting off with my credentials, I am a licensed funeral director and embalmer in 2 separate states in the Midwest United States. I went to college and I graduated with a bachelor's in mortuary science back in 2015. And through the processes of licensure, I went through my apprenticeship and then took my national boards and state board examinations, and I was licensed less than a year later, so in just before 2016. During my time in college as well, I was actually able to get my CCO, which is Certified Crematory Operator certification, but unfortunately since then it lapsed just because it's not always necessary in funeral service to be like all of those things. Some people have it, some people don't. But a lot of my future plans after this, since I've just been plugging away doing that for so many years, I would like to become a certified celebrant. And I'd also like to get as many acronyms as I can after my name on my business card.
Yeah, it's usually a good sign.
Yeah, exactly. But during that time, since 2015, I have worked at 3 different funeral homes. My first funeral home, I spent my apprenticeship there, it was 6 months for the state that I was practicing in. And so I spent most of that time doing care center work. So embalming, dressing, casketing, cosmetizing, that sort of thing. Worked a lot of visitations. That's kind of what they plug you with when you're an apprentice. And then my second funeral home, I dabbled in both, where I was pretty much half and half front and back of house. So I did arrangements, running funerals, and then also transfers, care center work. And then my current funeral home that I'm at, I am doing more front of house things. So I am doing arrangements, I am doing funeral directing, like actual directing of the funerals. And I help with the care center work when I can, but it's not always necessary, as they've pretty much, split our need between those 2 things. So directors kind of do like factory style, like assembly line, like you just do your thing for more efficiency, higher volume. So why exactly did I go into this? Why would I choose, quote unquote, this forsaken profession? Every director, during practicum, during apprenticeships would always say run whenever, we were getting into it. So why exactly did I stick with it? So my story starts off a lot more humble, but it becomes a lot more noble towards the end. I am very much accidentally in this profession. When I went to college, I had no intention of being a funeral director. I wanted to be a medical examiner. I loved CSI. I was all about that. I wanted to, be like Grisham from CSI. And I was like, okay, I want to find out how people, died. I want to, write the cause of death on the death certificate. And so I went to college for it. So first semester into college, I failed my first class, like ever in my entire life.
Oh, no.
I failed calculus. And to finish the medical examiner's program, I would have had to go up to like Calc 2 or 3. And I can't even do just basic calculus. So I had this like come to Jesus moment of like, oh my gosh, would I have to completely switch my gears and do something completely different? And so I looked at some of the other programs available at my college, and they were like, okay, well, mortuary science is available here, you'd still be dealing with dead bodies. And I'm like, okay, we'll do that. Like, it's close enough for right now. And so like, as I was going through the classes, and I was just like, I was getting scared in the program because every professor just tells you, you're going to lose your life to this profession. Like, you are going to give up holidays, you're giving up family time, you're working every other weekend, if not every weekend, and that was just, scaring the crap out of me. But once I actually got into, sitting in front of families and like actually having families that I cared for and saw through to the end, it really started to grow on me, and it really brought meaning to my life, whereas like I got to do the artistic portions of things that I loved doing, cosmetics, the technical aspects of embalming, and then just how meaningful it was to sit across from a table of somebody having the worst day in their entire life, and you're the one that actually gets to make it more palatable, gets to create that lasting image for them that's going to mean everything for the rest of their lives. And that's what turned the tables for me, is what made this a profession, made this a career for me. So I can't imagine doing anything else at this point. I feel like I'm good at it, and I'm happy to be where I am in this profession.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know that you stumbled it into that way, while you were going to college and experiencing that.
Yeah, I usually try not to tell that story because it's like it's not a very right, because I'll get asked by families all the time like, oh gosh, why do you do this? And I don't want to be like, accident.
It was the calculus.
Right, exactly. So what about you? How did you end up in this profession, or well, rather many professions, so I understand?
Right. So kind of like you in my younger years, I was very interested in the cold, crime case file shows. Definitely the medical examiner shows. I'm going to bring back a relic here. Do you remember Dr. G Medical Examiner? It aired in like 2004. I had to look it up. Yeah, so that was, absolutely one of my favorite shows when I was younger. And, what sort of young kid likes to watch a television show about a doctor, like, talking about pathology and, like, cutting up bodies? But, I didn't know that I could do something like that. I grew up in a very southern, conservative, small town, and I really didn't know about funeral directors or any sort of death care professionals at all. No one in my family had ever died growing up. I had a very, very small family. My grandparents are relatively young, and I think, a lot of people do have that mindset. Unless you are dealing with death, directly yourself, you really aren't thinking about funeral directors every day. So the first sort of experience I had with, the death care industry was an 11th grade summer reading assignment. So we had a list of books that we had to choose from, and one of the books was Stiff by Mary Roach. I don't know if you've ever read that, Red.
I actually have it on my shelf right now.
I also have it on my shelf right now. But for those of you that have never read it, it's a nonfiction book. And Mary Roach is a great writer. She writes for the masses, she writes in very palatable ways. And she covers a lot of sort of taboo subjects. So in this book in particular, she's talking about death. She's talking about what happens to your body after you die. So, she's talking about body donation programs, funeral directors, embalming, alternative burials, alternative disposition practices. So obviously I fell in love. I just absolutely was so interested in the book. I think I read it a couple times over. And I just, I knew that was something that I could do. Unfortunately, it wasn't really an option for me. It wasn't, being a funeral director wasn't something that everyone was like, yeah, go be a funeral director, go be around dead bodies all day for the rest of your life. And my mom even was mortified to even talk about the subject, really. So as I got older, I decided to kind of go in a different direction with my life. I actually went to college to get an undergrad in music, which is an entirely different story in and of itself. But at the end of 4 years, graduated with a degree in music performance on the double bass. And I realized that I didn't really want to be a professional musician. That wasn't the path for me. So what do I do now? So I actually went back to my original love for the deathcare industry, and I thought about, taking care of the deceased and the families, and how it just felt so right to me, and how I knew that I was the person that could do this, and that was important to me. So I actually went to my dad, who still lived in the small town that I grew up in, and he did me a huge favor. He knows the mayor of this small town, and he went to the mayor at the time and asked to hook me up with the only funeral director in town. So yay, dad connections.
Kudos to meeting the mayor before the funeral director. That's different.
Yeah, well, as I said before, a very, very small town atmosphere. But yeah, so I met with these funeral directors, and they were basically like, yeah, come aboard. Yeah, let's get you trained up to see a dead body. So I started working at the funeral home. I was allowed to do visitations. They trained me to do transfers. I was even allowed to sit in on arrangements. And eventually I decided that this was something that I needed to move forward in. So at that time, I was actually really invested in anything and everything that this wonderful woman, Caitlin Doty, was creating her content. She actually had these YouTube videos at the time called Ask a Mortician. I think I watched every single one of them. And she actually founded the Order of the Good Death, which is this organization that focuses on the good death, as it were. So home death, kind of a death positive sort of community. And she's so wonderful. I highly recommend her. Red, have you seen any of her videos?
I've seen a few of her videos, and I've read a few of her books. she comes highly recommended for me as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this was actually before her books even.
Oh,
so when YouTube was everyone's sole source of information. So anyways, that's where I got all of my information on how to become a funeral director. So I was basically like, Caitlin Doty, we're going to mortuary science school. So I Googled the best mortuary science school in America. And of course, the one in New York City popped up. And I decided that's where I was going. So I applied, I got in, I moved to New York City. And this was a 12-month program. So because I already had my bachelor's degree, this was more of an associate's degree trading school kind of situation. It was mainly focused on funeral director education, so no prereqs, nothing like that. So I did the 12 months there. I passed national boards. I actually decided not to take a state board exam. So I was living in New York City, and I realized that I didn't really want to live there anymore. It was exciting and fun, but I was not going to be there in the near future, or much less the far future. So basically, I decided to move to a different state. I moved out to the Midwest, and when I got out there, I started looking for a job. But I think what I didn't realize, not really having anyone in the industry, any family or anyone that I knew, if you did not go to school in the state you want to practice in, I think it's very, very difficult to be able to find a job once you go to a different state. If you think about it, the funeral directors that are practicing in their states have, probably lived there forever, family funeral home, or, they've kind of lived in the general area. And it's sort of a biased, kind of thing. If you went to the school in your state, you kind of want to work with other people that got the same education as you. So I was having an extremely difficult time finding a job. I think I applied to like every single funeral home within like a 40-mile radius of me. Took me over a year to find a job, but eventually I got a job at a funeral home near where I lived. And I actually was not hired on as an apprentice right off the bat. I was hired on as visitation staff. At that point, I was like desperate to get any sort of, experience in the funeral industry. So after working there for a while, I loved my job. I loved the people that worked there. It was, fulfilling and fun, and I knew that it kind of helped me realize that this was right and this was good. But as I progressed in my career, as I progressed in the funeral home, I kind of realized that this certain funeral home wasn't going to work out. We'll talk about it in a different episode. So actually, out of curiosity, I took a step back from the funeral home and I decided to try some other jobs in the funeral industry. I actually applied for a position at a body removal company. And for those of you guys who have never heard those three words together, it's an actual thing. It definitely exists. And I used to work there for 2 years.
That's actually pretty impressive that you worked for a livery company. Well, I shouldn't say livery company. Sometimes they're mixed. They dabble in both renting limos and picking up deceased. But 2 years, like that is honestly, if I have to say it, my least favorite part of the job is doing transfers. So kudos to you for doing 2 years of that.
Yeah, and that's so funny because that is absolutely my favorite part of the job, and it always has been, and it always will be, I think. Yeah, so I worked at that job, for a long time for my young life, and I loved it. I was actually a supervisor eventually in that company, and what we did, so say your grandpa is at home on hospice, he dies at home, very nice peaceful death, but he's at home. Someone has to get him to the funeral home, and that someone was me. So what body removal services do is they are contracted by funeral homes. And so if the funeral director is busy or they're with another family, currently attending another funeral, they will call the body removal service team and hire them, trust them to go pick up the deceased and bring them back to the funeral home. There was actually also a very short and brief period of my life where I worked at a cemetery as a family services counselor, also a pre-need salesperson. But that wasn't what they called me. It had a better fancy name that I can't even remember. And I think I was doing like double jobs. I was working at the body removal company and working for the cemetery at the same time. But I quickly realized that I am not the cemetery sales sort of person. So that was a short-lived experience, but an experience nonetheless. The company I worked for also worked for the medical examiner. And so what we did in that capacity is that we would go to any sort of medical examiner scene. So this would include if you were not on hospice and you died at home, suddenly, unexpectedly, any sort of car crash, accident, homicides even we used to go to, suicides, of course. And so what we would do is we would pick up the bodies for the medical examiner and his or her team and bring them back to the medical examiner's office. So the actual people on scene representing the medical examiner were these people called death investigators, and we're going to learn a lot about death investigators in the upcoming episodes. But basically, as I said, they're representatives of the medical examiner. So these death investigators were, former cops, nurses, people that had degrees in forensic science, really anyone with any sort of experience in investigations or dealing with dead bodies. And I was extremely curious about their job. I immediately thought that, or wondered if this was something that I could do or that I could get into with my background. And so I ended up befriending these people. I was working so much back in those days. I think I was working at like 24/7 at some point, like my phone is always on, always by my head. And I loved it. Of course I was tired sometimes, but I would always, jump in the car and just go. Especially to the medical examiner scenes. I just loved being there and talking to the death investigators and learning pretty much anything that I could about their job and what they do. Some of them would even, let me help, like hold a piece of paper, like something small like that, but it meant the world to me. And, eventually they started saying things like, hey, like we think that you would be good at this and we think that you can do this. And, we want to work with you, which is just such an amazing honor, like so humbled by those words. But they did end up talking to their supervisor, sort of recommending me for the job. So the next time a position opened up, I applied. And with my, background in education and, experience with the medical examiner's office while I was working for this body removal company, I got the job. And honestly, it has been a dream job for me. I have been working there for 2 years now at the medical examiner's office. I am a medical legal death investigator. I also do autopsies. I'm an autopsy assistant. And recently, I decided to take my education, again, a step further, and I applied to graduate school to be a pathologist assistant, which is basically a physician's assistant, but more focused on pathology. We'll talk about those guys too. But yeah, so that's me. That's where I am, graduate student / autopsy attendant.
Well, the cool thing about having both of us in this podcast is that we represent all the sides of the death industry. So especially you so much more than me, having all of those different facets to your diamond, which I think is really going to lend us to be able to answer questions even better than we could any other way.
Yeah. And, obviously Red has way more funeral directing experience than I ever will. And that's going to be an asset as well. And I'm glad I did not go into that specific part of the industry so that Red can talk about it more than me.
So one last story for us to end on is actually how we met. I think that's a really fun night of our lives.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and tell your side first?
Okay. Okay, yeah. So I remember a mutual friend of ours, we were out at a club, actually, and he was like, oh my gosh, you have to meet my friend Jem. Jem's into all that weird death stuff like you. And I was like, okay, cool. And I think we were both in costume that night. I believe.
Yeah, I think it was like Halloween or something.
Yeah, so we were both just giant nerds that night, and I took some photos of you because I thought your costume was really cool, and then we kind of just, we just exchanged phone numbers, and that was kind of it for it was good, history ever since then for me.
Yeah, I remember our mutual friend, like you said, he was like, hey, you're a funeral director. I know a funeral director. And I was like, what? No, that literally never happens. You're lying. You're a liar.
It never happens. Right.
It never does. So I was like, I have to know this person right now. So yeah, we met at this club, and I think he forced me to text you later. Yeah. Really cool. But believe it or not, we've actually been friends for about 4 years now.
Oh my gosh, has it really been that long?
Yes, it has.
Oh my gosh. And we've been running together pretty much ever since. Not necessarily, in the professional field, but, outside of the professional field. We have to have lives outside of what we do every day. Otherwise, we go crazy.
Yeah, and for that reason, we've actually never really talked to each other about our careers. We've always, had fun friend time whenever we're hanging out together. So we're learning along with you guys.
Yeah, actually, that's what I was most excited about this podcast, especially, just not disseminating information and, letting people know what we know, but learning from each other, because this is just a big collaboration from the both of us that, we just never talked about before. We really never had a reason to. So it's very exciting from both ends.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for coming along for the ride.
And that's all for this week. This has been our first official episode of our brand new podcast, MortMic.
Yeah, and thank you so much for listening and being patient with us as we figured out what's going to work best for us for our brand new podcast, MortMic. This podcast has been such a labor of love for us, and we are very excited to finally be able to bring it to you guys. We've both never done podcasting before, and there's been a lot of ups and downs learning how to record, edit, produce, and host. We considered our options on whether or not to publish our first few test recordings, but we really just loved the content so much, and we loved talking to each other and sharing, and we definitely just wanted to share with you guys, regardless of our technological learning curve. So thank you so much for sticking with us, and we promise that we'll have things all nice and settled and figured out for the upcoming episodes.
We'd also love to interact with you guys on our socials. Like, follow, and subscribe to us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at MortMic Podcast. That's MortMicPodcast. It would mean a lot to hear your feedback, so please tell us what you think in a comment or drop us a rating on whatever podcast hosting site you use. If you have any suggestions on topics you might want to hear about or some burning questions you might have, please shoot us an email at mortmicpodcast@gmail.com.
You can expect a new MortMic podcast every other Thursday. And definitely, if you have a comment or question, or if you just want to say hi, shoot us an email at mortmicpodcast, that's MortMic podcast@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook under MortMic Podcast. All of those will be easy to find, and you'll even maybe see the occasional funny death meme. I also want to give a huge thank you to our friend Marcin for the use of his song titled Deputies of Death, which he produced just for our show. We are so excited to be using it for our podcast, and you can check out some more of his music at his Bandcamp. That's Marcin, MARSON music.bandcamp.com. Thanks, Marcin.
Yeah, thanks, Marcin. Be sure to tune in every other week for more casual discussions on death. That's been MortMic for this week. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye now.